So we're having this conversation about socialism. As a Latina woman, one of the things that triggers Cubans is this triggers Cubans because they think about communism in Cuba. And so a lot of Latinos are driven away from the candidates that speak about these socialist programs because it's reminiscent of people standing in line in Cuba for a loaf of bread, as opposed to what we're talking about that I don't understand how it's become okay for people to take pride into being in debt and in acquiring all of this debt when you go to college. There's pride in that, especially in my community. We want to pay our student loans. We don't want a handout. We don't want a stimulus package. We work. So there's a lot of preying on people's insecurities and issues, cultural issues that we carry. And so what would you say to someone that is in these marginalized groups with regards to education and healthcare, how that doesn't make you lazy? It doesn't mean that you don't want to do your part in a society. It is right for us to have that it is wrong for us to graduate from college and be in extreme debt. And what are the words that you would give to them, and in a way that they can digest it, because this is the misinformation that we have to unpack and we have to combat every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have so long misconstrued a handout versus human basic rights. And it boggles my mind where we have this conversation about what you should have as a citizen versus what is considered a handout. And a lot of times what we consider a handout is what we should have. Like, we should have access to healthcare. We should have access to education. We should have access to quality foods in our communities. Like, it shouldn't take a lobbyist buying a politician for us to get a Whole Foods in the hood. But that is the system that we subscribe to. And we just idealize capitalism and wealth way too much, especially in the Black and brown community, because that is a marker of success. And we don't realize that there's so many like shadow figures behind that success to make it happen, and so many people whose livelihoods are jeopardized to make one person wealthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add on to that, I'd say that there are a lot of people who see that they look at it like a socialism would be a handout, as you just pointed out, Chloe, but they also, it's kind of worse than that because they watch a lot of TV and a lot of movies and they think that, well, traditionally Americans believe we got to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We got to go out there and conquer it. We got to go out and create something from nothing. And the reality is, even if you buy into that premise, the problem is the corporations have been predominantly the ones getting richer as we get poorer and poorer. I mean, the average worker hasn't had a raise, a real functional raise, considering inflation in the last 30 years. So the game is rigged against you, even if you believe hard work is what pays off. I mean, this is a country where we had children working in sweatshops losing limbs. And it took what's called a workers' march, a workers unionizing in order to fight back to get workers' rights. I mean, capitalism just continued to strip people. Of course, we can go back to slavery. We can talk about Jim Crow. We can talk about all these instances. But at the end of the day, guys, it's not people have been mind fucks to the point where they are working against themselves. Like they you know, and to unravel that, you have to tell them some hard truths. What I call it is sprinkle some facts on them, give them like one thing and say, hey, when was the last time do you think you got a raise? You may look like it on your check, but if you go back, you really didn't. And maybe you should look into that. And I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, I mean, it's that mentality that we have, like, you know, I'm not a millionaire yet, but I'm gonna get there. And it's like, sorry, most of us, all of the people we know, we're not going to be millionaires, and we're not on the cusp of being a millionaire. And again, it's this internalized self-hatred of working class people, but also glorification, you know, of millionaires and of wealth. And exactly what Tim was saying, like, we forget just how American socialism is, right? We have an 8-hour workday. We have a weekend because of socialists, right? In the 30s, and fighting for our rights in the early or before the 30s, right? But they didn't actually pass reforms until then. Haymarket Square riots, that's what May 1st was about, which is the International Workers' Day. And the only place that doesn't celebrate May 1st is in the US, because they have deliberately erased our own history so that we don't remember that actually we have a very rich history of workers rising up, demanding their rights.
You know what, Tim, it's funny because the first book that I read to completion was The Jungle. And I was like 9 years old, and that book traumatized me. I remember because, you know, I learned, I spoke Spanish first, and I learned English watching television or whatever. But I remember reading The Jungle because I started reading everything because my teacher was like, you want to get out of here? She was my Debbie Allen. The way you get out of here is reading. It wasn't dancing. So I started reading everything. And when I read that book, I was just like, whoa, this country is evil. Like,
yes.
I was, you know what I mean? I was just like, to do that, you watch the Hunger Games and people are appalled, but we have a history of the Hunger Games that's real in this, the richest country on the planet. And I can look underneath the freeway right here and see about 50 homeless people that are struggling. And a great percentage of those people went overseas and fought for this country's freedoms. And they still can't even get a proper treatment at the VA. So I do want to make sure that when we have these conversations that we do not ignore the realities of people of color, because that's my focus. Because I think a lot of times when we have these conversations, a lot of people ride on the backs of people of color, specifically Black people, which I'm not afraid to say, is that we ride on the movements of Black people. And then when it's time for Black people to need us, we turn our backs. And it's important to have these conversations because this is the reason why there's such an imbalance in this country. I think that when we talk about these things, I'm done having conversations. I don't know where you are online. I'm done having conversations with people who don't have a grasp on any form of information and humanity, the two components. Because you can be dumb and have a good soul, and I can rock with you. Right? But I can't rock with evil, right? Because when we talk about Black people in America, we don't want to have the conversations. There's no way we're going to make progress until we have the conversations. I really want to talk about socialism in directly when it comes to African Americans in America, because I had so many Black people tell me, you take that communist shit back to Cuba. And I'm like, but I'm Puerto Rican and Dominican.
You know, it's so funny. That's so funny you say that, Aida, because I went to Cuba after Obama lifted the embargo. And let me tell you something, African Americans were going to Cuba like it was the promised land. I could not turn a corner without seeing massive groups of like Black travel groups. And I don't like to travel with groups. So they were very noticeable when you can see like everybody's wearing a t-shirt and got the camera out. And it was so interesting because almost everybody that I spoke to, Black person who went to Cuba after the embargo was lifted, came back with this like romanticism about the country. And they were like, see, they all getting along and all the Black and brown people are getting together and we should have that here. And I was like, you completely glossed over how they got to the point, which was the brutality of communism and a violent takeover. So you can't just skip over 60 years to be like, look, they're in the street having fun. It's like we have to understand all of the like increments of power that got to the place where Cuba is today. And if you talk to real Cubans who are there, they'd be like, yeah, this is not what it looks like. Yes, we all have healthcare, but wealth still plays a factor in the type of treatment that you receive here. But we don't hear that. We hear like everybody's treated like a human being despite their color. And so I think we as African Americans need to understand a little bit more about what is happening in the political climates around the world and how it impacts brown people specifically.
I just want to jump in. I don't mean to contradict that at all. I also went when the embargo was lifted to Cuba, and it was incredible. You know, and there's a lot to critique about the Castro administration and the revolution. But I do know that two of the campaigns that I most admire, right, as Obama said as well, and Bernie Sanders said it, but then he got hammered for it, was, you know, the programs of literacy and then the programs of anti-racism, like deliberate anti-racist programs. Whereas before, under Batista and others, like there was a lot more racial tension and hatred. And then through a specific like educational program, it's not been unlearned, but like attempting to do that. And so I almost see that as like a bright spot in the Cuban Revolution. We don't have to get into it and like completely go, but like it is an example of like, hey, maybe racism can actually be both unlearned in school, but also structurally dismantled.
I agree. I absolutely do agree. But in America, we see that the powers that be will never allow us to have an intellectual conversation and philosophical change over a philosophy. And that's never going to happen. It has to be war, bloodshed, people fleeing in their jets, people acquiring and hacking billionaires' accounts. Like, it's never going to be like, let's come to the table, Black and brown people, and figure out how we fucked up. Like, that's never going to happen here.
Chloe's been trying to set this bitch on fire since I met her.
What's that saying? Power concedes nothing without a demand, right?
That's right.
Is that what you're talking about? So we got to go take it, or they're not, just going to ignore it and bury us under fake news headlines. I was doing some research. I'm gonna be honest, guys. I'm trying to get up to speed to where you are, but what I've come to understand is that radically to make this shift towards socialism, there's a stop at communism, and then that's sort of like people kind of demanding like workers' rights. That's always like the fundamental driver. Like, hey, we're getting screwed by the corporations. We need to somehow get rights for workers individually, so that we are not just slave workers or whatever. And then that kind of leads way to socialism. Not to belabor the point, is that sort of how Cuba went through the progression, or was it different?
Go ahead, Francesca.
I mean, from what I understand about the Cuban Revolution, they weren't actually explicitly communist at all. Okay. And in fact, that was sort of like the card under Fidel's, up his sleeve. Like, guess what? We believe in egalitarianism. And the difference between, I think, communism and socialism, from my understanding, is that socialism is you can have more of a mixed economy. So there can be more private enterprises, whereas in Cuba, that was not allowed, has not been allowed. So you have Scandinavian countries like Denmark and Sweden, et cetera, always as those examples of having like a strong social safety net, but with also private, there's banks and stuff, obviously, and they're also losing a lot of ground. And then communism is a little even more extreme. So like, again, super top down, regimented government, full government control.
Everything owned by the government. People don't own their own businesses. Everything goes back to the state. So
it's been interesting because I've been thinking about China right now, and you see China is like it's essentially the worst of both worlds. And I'm not trying to jump on the like Trumpian anti-Asian, I am Chinese, like, right. Like the anti-Asianness about it, but it is like this state-run capitalism. So it's like nobody has a say, and it's super capitalist, but you're going to get maybe like a test for COVID-19, So it's like, they don't want people to totally die, but they're not going to like, there's no workers' rights. Do you know what I'm saying?
Gotcha. Yeah. Aida, I didn't mean to hijack. It's just that for people dumb like me, I just want to make sure they walk away learning something from you smart ladies. That's all.
This is what this is for. This is what this is for. This is so that we can have these conversations, because you don't ever see these conversations being had by people that look like us. It's always, a slither of it, and then we look, crazy. But I really do want to talk about socialism from this perspective, because I remember when we could have a conversation about things and be semi-objective and be able to look at other sides. But now you can't do that. You can't celebrate that the fact that children in Cuba learn algebra when they're like in 4th grade, and here they learn it in high school. Right. Because if you say that, then you're anti-American. And so what do you guys have to say about that? How now we can't even have a nuanced conversation about things because everything is so extreme. You're either on one side or the other. And there are benefits to that. I don't know if you saw the news stories, but I saw Cuban doctors getting on airplanes going all over the world.
Going to Italy.
Yeah. So when we talk about that, we can't even say that there are some benefits to some of this, but we can't. We have to say that this is the best, and look at as for us, the people who are here. Is it the best for us?
It is. It is interesting because having been to Cuba, it definitely opened my eyes to kind of like the cult of personality and the cult of a nation, which is you put the country before everything else. And being American and watching just like their level of patriotism that they have, we kind of be like, oh, this is fanatical. But then here in America, we have the same level of fanatical patriotism with all these people who are protesting to open back up their state so that they can get a haircut and go to the beach. And so what happens is when you actually interact with people who are from those countries that we've heard these big bad stories about, you kind of understand the nuance, and you understand that it's not as soul crushing or as inhumane as we have been taught, like, oh, they have no rights and they don't do anything, blah, blah, blah. Like it balanced out. There definitely was some traumatic times in Cuba, and it's kind of like balanced out. There's still problems as with everywhere else. But when you look at us, we don't even want to acknowledge that we were duped and oppressed the same way other peoples in other countries have been, because we always live up to this fantasy that America is the greatest place in the world. And it's not. And so in order for us to have the conversation about socialism, you have to tell the people who are privileged, it's time for you to share your pie. You have to tell the people who support the people who are privileged, your God is a false God. And you have to tell the people who are poor, help is on the way, don't give up. And so that's such a long, loaded conversation. It's like, well, who's gonna pull the trigger first? And no one wants to pull the trigger.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think it's also ridiculous the ways that we're taught that suddenly if you have universal health care, right? Like, I mean, like Medicare for all type, that you're Cuba. That's just not, that's not a reality. Mm-hmm. That's not true. And our democracy doesn't go out the window because we have healthcare for all. And I've been taking this time in quarantine to read W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'm like, my mind is getting blown. I'm reading about his book, The Black Reconstruction, and he's a socialist, right? And he lays out this wonderful argument, and I think a lot of Black leaders have taken up this mantle and very much understand this. But I think for someone who's half white, whatever, like privileged, like didn't understand this very much. But the ways in which our social safety net in the U.S. has been kept down specifically to keep African Americans from accessing better education, better healthcare, and privileges and rights. So like suddenly in the South, when slavery was abolished and there was like, okay, we're going to do this reconstruction. The reconstruction didn't last for very long because essentially it was like, it's more complicated than this, but it's like, oh no, true egalitarianism means we have to invest in these public services that are going to help a lot of Black people. And we can't have that. We'd rather divide and conquer, pitting poor whites against poor Blacks. And, and you see in like, Ronald Reagan's advisor, Lee Atwater, same Lee, he said, he's like, first you say the N-word, and then you can't say the N-word anymore because they'll call you on your racism. So instead, we talk about busing, and instead we talk about all these other policies about how, no, we shouldn't have affirmative action, or no, we shouldn't have, public schools, or yes, we should keep private. And it's essentially the same way to disenfranchise and disempower the Black community, but you don't have to actually name it.
Yeah. And also, sorry.
Yeah, I think that with the Black community specifically, when it comes to socialism and kind of waking their eyes up to what's happening, I just tell them that corporations already have it. Corporations get bailouts. Corporations get the hookup. I never heard, like, I hear from older Black people, all the time. I grew up with it hearing, we need to do for ourselves, and we can't be asking people for stuff. But I never saw Boeing get back a check. Ever. They never returned it. And right now, what's going on with COVID-19, the perfect example. I mean, corporations they're sending money back and saying, my bad, but they took the money to begin with. They didn't have to take the money to begin with. So that's the reality of it. And if we look at in the past where we were fighting for our equal rights, I'm the first Black male in my family to be able to sit on a bus where I want. Okay, that's the reality of where we are in the United States. So we're just getting started. You think we'd be smart enough to say we could take a little bit from socialist tent, take a little bit from the capitalist tent, and make a better society. But we have people that just buy into propaganda. I blame the media, y'all, not us.
Yeah, you and Donald Trump.
The media that lies and put these falsehoods in people's minds to control them. That's why what Francesca does is so important. Same thing with you, Chloe, and you, Aida, you stepping into it. This is why we do what we do, to make sure people become educated so they realize that these lies are being perpetuated. I mean, and we can go on and on. I could talk about this for hours, but I just say, look, if we continue to spread the truth about what's happening with socialism, what it really means, and that if you got a police force, you got socialism. If you have a fire department, you have socialism. That's what socialism is in its purest form, and that's what we need to elevate. In
the post office.
Right? But we say it in arguments. Like, how many videos have you seen when someone's having a confrontation with the police and they say, "You work for me"? It's like, so we understand the concept. Right. We just don't have the power and infrastructure in place to back up the statement and actually, change the power shift. And I think the whole big thing, I don't want to get too far ahead, but I do think that we can have all of these things that we're talking about. And I do believe it will come in the form of reforming Amazon and Jeff Bezos having an answer for being a trillionaire, because there's so many people across the country who have worked for this company who can attest to how bad the conditions are. And while he's being celebrated, they're actually finding their voice and being amplified and saying, no. We're treated like indentured servants and almost like enslaved people. You're working 10 to 14 hour shifts. You get a half-hour lunch break 2 15-minute breaks. By the time you walk across the warehouse to pee, your break is over. So it's like we need to start really exposing all of the trauma that's causing this great achievement of great wealth.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the comments, and Patrick Northern said media is a corporation. And I want to say, yes, it is. And a lot of these shows are reality shows. Like when you're watching Sean Hannity, you're not watching a journalist, you're watching a TV personality. And you have to understand the difference between the two, because those are the people that are giving you information and the people who are misleading you, because they are also getting checks from the corporations that are driving all of us. And it goes all the way up. And we don't understand that, you know. Look at all the stuff that happens with the election. So with all due respect, you and I have talked about it. I'm cool with all the celebrities jumping in now that want to say, hey, guys, you guys need to do this for your vote and you need to do that. Where were you, you know, because I came under a lot of fire for supporting Bernie Sanders, because I was told I kept being accused of supporting Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders as being anti-Black. And then all of a sudden, Elizabeth Warren, who was getting checks, became, you know, like the person that they said had the greatest agenda when it came to Black people. And I was just like, well, I am so anti a person who collects checks that I can't believe that you can take checks from corporations and be pro-Black people unless you're telling those corporations to participate in the reparations to the Black people, because you built a lot of your wealth on the backs of them. So I just think that the socialism conversation in this country has been hijacked so much by the wrong people that we have to break this down. We have to unpack it. I want to move forward, because we can't talk about socialism without talking about capitalism. But what I will say this, as a single mom who has been broke, who has been homeless, I can't tell you how pissed off I am about paying tax dollars, knowing that the senators and the representatives of my state can send their children to the best schools, have the best health care, while I'm paying the money for their salary. And my kids can't even, I had to take my kids to a public hospital because I didn't have proper health care for them.
Or you get $500 for your kid.
Yes. And so when you think about that, when people talk about how anti-socialism they are, and they talk about how, you know, the way the system works in America, it's like, look at those people. Like AOC is one of the few people who actually puts herself on the line and says, yo, the people in my community, we all got to eat. This can't just be about me. And then there are the squad, those women that are doing that. But when you look at everybody else, there's an abundance of politicians that we glamorize because they're people of color and they look like us, and they're delivering the talking points that we're emotionally moved by, but they don't give a damn about us as people, because if they did, they would not be taking money from Big Pharma, knowing how much our Black people and brown people are affected by the unbalance in the pharmaceutical game right now.